Riel is particularly interested in the theory of anticipation. And secondly, he has been developing a method called futures literacy. And now, with all his might and all his powers, he's going to explain us what does it mean.
Thank you. I think I've got this one.
Right, yeah.
Thank you.
The floor is yours, Riel.
Thank you very much, Marco, and very, very kind introduction. And a great privilege to be here. See a lot of people I know, and I think a lot of people I've managed to work with over the years. So it's a great pleasure. I don't have a lot of time. I'm going to go quickly. I'm going to cover, I hope, a lot of ground and something that should be interesting for everyone. Let me just say, inspired in part by what René said, I think one of the things about this conference that's indicative to me is the question of birth and death and the relationship to complexity and human agency. And I think we have a challenge, in fact, to reconcile humanity with complexity. And the question of when things are born and when they die, and whether or not firms, let's say General Electric, should be immortal, is one of those questions that I think we need to be asking. Certainly endogenous adaptation for permanent resilience is something that has its virtues. But I think there's also a virtue in things that disappear, as John Casti said at the beginning of this conference. And I think one of the great challenges for us is to understand both sides of that equation, and to be able to think about it and to make choices that are consistent and, in fact, embrace evolutionary change. So that's I think, one of our great challenges. But let me just go in an empirical vein, as we had in the previous presentation. These are the futures literacy labs that I've managed to organize around the world over the last 4 or 5 years. And here's the list in detail. You'll see that many different parts of the world, many different topics, many different participants. These were futures literacy laboratories. And the purpose of these laboratories was to check, to discover, to examine, to chart futures literacy, to see what futures literacy as a capability means and whether we can discover it at an empirical level in the world around us. Can people hear me here? Good. So futures literacy is a capability that rests on an understanding of the discipline of anticipation. Knowing why you want to use the future determines what kind of future to imagine. This is an ontological challenge. Knowledge creation processes, describing different kinds of imaginary futures, requires different kinds of knowledge creation processes. The how-to of anticipation. This is the epistemological side. Anticipatory assumptions consist of why, what, and how of imagining the future. Now, I hope everybody understands the future can only be imagined when we're talking about conscious human anticipation. We have no choice. We can only imagine it. So the question becomes, what kind of future are we imagining? If we can distinguish futures in an ontological sense, and if we can distinguish them in an ontological sense, how do we know them? How do we try to understand them? What I've been trying to do over the last decades, in fact, is to chart, map, understand, discover this capacity that humans have to use the future. And I put this up. This is going to be published in the book that's forthcoming at the end of this year, a book that I've been working on now for about 2 years. And obviously, I can't describe in detail all the elements here, but I want you to understand that there's an ontological side and an epistemological dimension, that there's anticipation for the future, which is mostly what we hear about, where the purpose of thinking about the future is something to do with planning or preparation, and anticipation for emergence. And anticipation for emergence is not about the future. In fact, often, if you're thinking about how do I get to the future, or what does the future mean for me, it will obscure emergence. It will obscure novelty. And so we have this challenge of understanding that there is a diversity of ways of thinking and using the future, and therefore the question becomes, how do we map them? And the futures literacy laboratories that I put up on the screen at the beginning, those futures literacy labs, they were designed explicitly to detect anticipatory assumptions in all 6 areas. The challenge here is, how do you get people to use the future, to demonstrate that they themselves are becoming futures literate in all these different areas? And the Futures Literacy Laboratories, and we're running one tomorrow here in Turku, are designed explicitly to discover those different aspects of anticipatory assumptions. And I want to say here, in an audience I think that is really in the midst of all this, that I'm trained as an economist. And one of the things that in economics was always very powerful was the existence of certain key concepts. Supply and demand, for instance, or the notion of value added. These concepts were useful for us to discuss things, for us to have disciplinary discussions, for us to extend our discipline, to help people use and understand what economics meant. And in my view, one of the fundamental attributes of the research and application of the future has to do with understanding anticipatory assumptions. I won't go through AA1, AA2, AA3, 4, 5, 6, but it's important to understand that each of those has its own characteristics. And each of those is defined by a different set of criteria. The one other thing I want to add in this is there's the issue of non-conscious anticipation, which is very important. And this has, I think, been discussed, and we heard earlier from Ted Fuller about Robert Rosen and the anticipatory systems approach. But it's one of I think, the issues that has great relevance for all the work we've been discussing over the last 2 days, which is this universe is anticipatory. It has time and space movement. And that means that we can incorporate anticipation into many, many things, including incorporating anticipation in ways that are not conscious. Be it animals or trees or other parts of this universe can incorporate the idea that there will be later, not necessarily consciously. And this allows us to extend the discipline, but it also reinforces critically the idea that we need to begin to distinguish different kinds of future. Because the kind of future a cat thinks about and the kind of anticipation that a tree does are not the same thing. And our ability to distinguish those different kinds of futures is a very important opening scientifically into understanding how the future is used. So, what is the future? How is it used? This is it's all over the place. People are using the future. And one of the difficulties in mapping futures literacy, in detecting futures literacy, or detecting the people's capacity to use the future, is that they're not aware of it themselves. A child that's able to track a ball rolling across a table before they can talk, they don't understand, of course, that they're anticipating that the ball will roll across. A child that's hungry, that cries and expects food, they don't realize that they're engaging in anticipatory activity. Anticipatory activity is very strongly anchored. Preparation and planning are very natural, but also very invisible. So one of the difficulties in tracking the capacity to use the future was how to get people to say, I'm using the future. If you just ask them, they say, what do you mean? What's that? I don't understand. So this was the challenge of designing the Futures Literacy Laboratories, to discover how people use the future when they do not realize they're using the future. So, this is not a new scientific challenge. Physicists had this problem with cyclotrons, making the invisible visible. And Futures Literacy Laboratories use the Futures Literacy Framework that I just put up on the screen, diagram 1 there, as a way to try and explore futures literacy. Anticipatory systems, kinds of futures, collective intelligence, knowledge creation, action research and action learning. The research objective, making the invisible visible, proof of concept level evidence for the pertinence of the futures literacy framework. I wanted to be able to show that people are using the future in ontologically distinct way, and obviously we know from the future studies field, we're using it in many epistemologically different ways. So the question then also is the relationship between the ontology and the epistemology, and the relationship of design principles for futures literacy laboratories, and how that connects up to how people use the future. Can we initiate a process whereby people become futures literate? So the value proposition here is that futures literacy framework helps to design futures literacy laboratories that generate ontological expansion by cultivating futures literacy. In other words, when people can use the future differently and they understand that they're using it differently, they can go outside the box. And getting outside the box, call it innovation, call it adaptation, whether it's endogenous or exogenous, is one of the critical contributions that using the future can make. And in that sense, coming back to what I said at the beginning, is one of the critical ways to connect human agency, to reconcile our free will, not with the role of gods or engineers, dominating tomorrow by colonizing it through path dependency, but rather being able to expand our understanding of novelty, to embrace spontaneity, and to be more capable of a resilience approach based on diversification rather than insurance and determinism. So, I think that this connects up with some important changes taking place in the social sciences. I talked about Robert Rosen and anticipatory systems and the discipline of anticipation. But I think there's also something else happening, and we've experienced it here at this conference, and I think most of us have been involved in it in one way or another. I call it the microscope of the 21st century. And it has to do with these tools that we invent that reveal things. So the microscope revealed something to us. We could look into a drop of water and we could see the bacteria, but we didn't know what it meant, what sense it had. And so 200 years later, we started to wash our hands when we were doing surgery. We understood that there was a relationship between a clean hand and a surgeon and infection. But it took 200 years. Today, what are we doing in so much of the futures work, in so many of these collective intelligence, knowledge creation processes, these events, like the one that I think was just in this room on the future of work? What are we doing there? What we're doing, in my mind, is not searching for statistics, generalities, aggregates, common denominators. We're actually finding a way of discovering, making sense, giving meaning to specificity. Complexity consists not just of the macro and the general, it consists of constant, unbelievably rich time, place, specificity. Things that are unique. Some of them last, some of them don't. But how can we make sense of that? How can we appreciate that? How can we give meaning to that? And this is, I think, what we're trying to do in part with these processes of collective intelligence knowledge creation. Narrative capacity, collective intelligence, capacity to reframe. I'm going to put this up. It's got a lot of detail. I'm just going to do it very quickly. I don't have a lot of time. If I put discontinuity and continuity there, and reactive preparation and improvisation unprecedented at this end. Here we have reform. It's about continuity. It's about being prepared. General Electric, another 100 years. Nation state, another 1,000 years, right? The nation state, what a wonderful thing. We want to preserve it forever. Or was that the Roman Empire? Sorry. Discontinuity, we can valorize the past, we can retrofit strategic. We can have a transformative strategy in dealing with adaptation in the context of the unprecedented. And then there's a whole category of discovery and creation. And one of the amazing things I think about our anticipatory systems, and here I'm speaking about humans, is that we actually can engage in ontological expansion. If the universe consists of information, which is one of the ways of thinking about the universe, we have this incredible capacity to actually expand the universe through our creativity and our imagination, through novelty, through eureka. Something that we didn't know and didn't understand before. And it doesn't need to be genius. It can be each person's discovery relative to where they started. So I think that this issue for us in the context of understanding futures literacy and reconciling humanity's capacity to act with the wonder, the mystery of complexity, and therefore turning uncertainty from the terrible, terrible enemy of planning to the wonderful resource of our capacity to be creative. And that allows us to move from the science of generality and managerialism to also include experimentalism and the science of specificity. A transformation that we are in the middle of, that we're pioneering in the context of a change in humans' capacity, because our tools are incredibly powerful, but also our aspirations. We aspire to develop our capacity to be free, to use Amartya Sen, to not just escape from the oppression of starvation or authoritarianism, but to go beyond that and to be able to exercise our capacity to be free. I always want to put up Karl Popper. I think it's important for us to recall the extent to which indeterminism is really a scientific consensus, I believe, that we must take into account. The appeal, and part of the reason this conference talks about complexity, is because it's something we really need to begin to turn into practice. All of the aspects of the world around us today are crying out for an end to the engineering, predictive approach as the only approach to security, to safety, to happiness. And this is a profound and deep transformation. It's a paradigmatic transformation. And when you start to listen for that paradigmatic transformation, the way I do as much as I can, you hear people talking as if the earth was flat, even though we know it's round. And this is a very difficult change to make in our own thinking, in our own practices. And I believe that futures literacy is one of the prerequisites for us to be able to make that transition. And I think the work that we're doing here, in our different ways, in our different directions, with our different experiments, all of that is in part reactive. It's part of the era, of the times that we're in, but it's also critical in terms of dealing with the realities that we have in front of us. This is my last slide, as many of you know. It's my quiet denunciation of a certain way of thinking about leadership and change. I think everybody would agree that this doesn't look like a very smart way to think about going from one place to the next. Often, this is the way people think about leadership and change, but I don't think it makes very much sense. Human agency and complexity, resilience and values in the present, they depend on changing the way we anticipate, becoming futures literate. And I believe that futures literacy is something that we're all practicing, and of course we can get better at it. Thank you very much.